The principal's voice echoed down the hallway as Sarah clutched her daughter's trembling hand. But what she saw through the gymnasium doors made her question everything she thought she knew about justice. A figure in a worn leather jacket stood with his back to them, shadow-boxing against the afternoon light streaming through dusty windows, and when he turned around, the impossible became undeniable. Emma's tear-stained cheeks told the story of another brutal day at Jefferson Elementary, where the circle of tormentors had grown bolder with each passing week. But something in her mother's determined stride suggested this Tuesday would be different from all the others. The way Sarah's jaw set as she pushed through the school's front doors carried the weight of a decision that would ripple through their small Virginia town like stones thrown into still water. If you're watching this unfold and wondering how far a mother will go to protect her child, hit that subscribe button right now and tell us in the comments where you're watching from, because this story is about to take a turn that'll leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about standing up for what's right. And don't forget to smash that hype button, because what happens next will restore your faith in unexpected heroes. The morning had started like any other, with Emma picking at her cereal while Sarah rushed through her nursing scrubs, both of them pretending not to notice the fresh bruise blooming purple along Emma's forearm. The silence between them had grown heavier over the past month, filled with all the words neither knew how to say. Emma's backpack sat by the door like a loaded weapon, and Sarah found herself staring at it while her coffee grew cold, wondering when her daughter's education had become a daily battle for survival. Marcus Thompson had been the ringleader since September, a 12-year-old with dead eyes and fists that moved faster than the teachers could catch. His followers circled Emma during recess like wolves, their taunts about her second-hand clothes and her father's absence cutting deeper than any physical blow. The school's response had been a series of meaningless meetings and empty promises, each administrator passing the responsibility to the next like a hot potato no one wanted to hold. Sarah had tried the proper channels first, believing in systems and procedures the way her mother had taught her to believe in hard work and fairness. 3 meetings with the principal, 2 with the guidance counselor, and 1 awkward conference call with Marcus's parents had yielded nothing but polite deflection and bureaucratic doublespeak. The bruises on Emma's arms grew darker while the adults spoke in circles about conflict resolution and restorative justice, words that meant nothing when your 8-year-old daughter flinched every time someone approached her. The breaking point came on a Monday morning when Emma refused to get out of bed, her small body curled into a ball beneath covers that couldn't protect her from the cruelty waiting at school. Sarah sat on the edge of the mattress, watching her daughter's shoulders shake with silent sobs, and felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. The mother who had always followed rules and trusted authority died quietly in that moment, replaced by someone willing to color outside the lines if it meant keeping her child safe. That's when Sarah remembered the community center downtown, the one with the faded boxing posters and the sound of leather hitting canvas that drifted through open windows on summer evenings. She'd driven past it countless times on her way to work, never thinking much about the weathered building or the men who gathered there to train. But desperation had a way of opening doors that seemed permanently closed, and Tuesday afternoon found her standing in the parking lot with Emma's hand in hers, both of them staring at a place that might hold answers. The gym smelled of old sweat and determination, a mixture of leather and liniment that spoke of countless hours spent learning to fight back. Heavy bags hung from the ceiling like sleeping giants, and the ring in the center of the room wore the scars of 1,000 battles. Sarah had expected to find the usual collection of young fighters and aging trainers, men who understood violence in ways she never wanted to learn. What she hadn't expected was the figure moving through shadowboxing combinations with the fluid grace of someone who had once danced with greatness. He was older now, his hair silver where it had once been black, but the way he moved through space still carried echoes of the man who had floated like a butterfly and stung like a bee. The leather jacket hung loose on his frame, and his hands, wrapped in tape that had seen better days, cut through the air with precision that spoke of muscle memory deeper than conscious thought. When he turned toward them, his eyes held the same fire that had once stared down Sonny Liston and Joe Frazier, though now it burned with a different kind of purpose. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as recognition hit her like a physical blow. The face was unmistakable despite the years, the same strong jaw and intelligent eyes, that had graced magazine covers and inspired a generation to believe in the impossible. But this couldn't be real, couldn't be happening in a rundown gym in small-town Virginia, where her daughter's bullies thought they ruled the world. Muhammad Ali had been gone for years, his voice silenced by Parkinson's disease and time. Yet here he stood, unwrapping his hands with the same careful attention he had once given to preparing for championship fights. Emma's grip on her mother's hand tightened as the man approached them, his footsteps silent on the worn canvas floor. Up close, the illusion should have shattered, revealing itself as wishful thinking or desperate imagination. Instead, it solidified into something that defied explanation but demanded acceptance. The way he carried himself, the slight tremor in his hands that spoke of battles fought both in and out of the ring, the gentle smile that had once charmed reporters and intimidated opponents, every detail confirmed what Sarah's rational mind insisted was impossible. "How look like someone who's tired of watching from the sidelines," he said, his voice carrying the same cadence that had once proclaimed himself the greatest, though now it held notes of compassion that championships couldn't teach. Emma stepped closer to her mother, but her eyes remained fixed on the stranger who somehow felt familiar, as if he had stepped out of history books and into their desperate Tuesday afternoon. Sarah found her voice somewhere between disbelief and hope, the words tumbling out in a rush that carried months of frustration and fear. She told him about Emma's bruises and the school's indifference, about feeling powerless in a system designed to protect everyone except the children who needed it most. The man listened without interruption, his attention focused entirely on their story, as if nothing else in the world mattered. And when Sarah finished speaking, the silence that followed felt heavy with possibility. "Fighting isn't always about throwing punches," he said, his gaze shifting to Emma, who had begun to emerge from behind her mother's protective shadow. "Sometimes it's about standing tall when everyone expects you to fall down. Sometimes it's about finding your voice when the world tries to keep you quiet. And sometimes," he added with a smile that seemed to light up the dingy gym, "it's about showing bullies that they picked the wrong target." The training began that afternoon, though it looked nothing like what Sarah had expected. Instead of teaching Emma to throw punches, the man focused on something more fundamental: the way she carried herself, the confidence in her voice, the light in her eyes that bullies had tried so hard to extinguish. He showed her how to stand with her shoulders back and her chin up, how to speak with authority even when her voice wanted to shake, how to project strength that came from somewhere deeper than muscle and bone. "Champions aren't made in the ring," he told Emma as she practiced walking across the gym with newfound purpose. "They're made in moments when they decide they won't be victims anymore. They're made when they choose to fight for something bigger than themselves." His words carried the weight of experience, of battles won and lost, of a lifetime spent proving that greatness came not from avoiding conflict, but from facing it with courage and dignity. Days blended into weeks as Emma's transformation began to take shape, subtle at first, but growing stronger with each session. The tremor in her voice when she spoke about school gradually disappeared, replaced by a steadiness that surprised even Sarah. The way Emma held herself changed too, her posture straightening as if invisible strings were pulling her toward the sky, her steps gaining confidence that had been missing for months. The man worked with Emma on more than just physical presence, teaching her the art of verbal self-defense that had once made him famous for wit, as sharp as his jabs. He showed her how to deflect insults with humor, how to turn a bully's words back on themselves without descending to their level, how to command respect through intelligence rather than intimidation. These lessons took place in the quiet corners of the gym, away from the heavy bags and speed bags, in spaces where wisdom mattered more than strength. But the real change came in Emma's eyes, where fear had been replaced by something that looked suspiciously like hope. She began to smile again, tentative at first but growing brighter with each passing day, and Sarah found herself remembering the daughter she had almost lost to the cruelty of children who had learned too young that power came from making others small. The transformation wasn't magic, but it felt close enough to make Sarah believe in miracles again. The test came on a Thursday morning when Marcus Thompson cornered Emma by the water fountains, his usual crew flanking him like backup singers waiting for their cue. Sarah watched from the hallway, her heart hammering against her ribs as her daughter faced the moment that would define everything that came after. The old Emma would have cowered, would have tried to make herself invisible until the storm passed. This Emma stood her ground. "So you think you're tough now?" Marcus sneered, his voice carrying the practiced cruelty of someone who had never faced real consequences. "You think your mummy can protect you forever?" The words were designed to wound, to reduce Emma to the frightened child she had been just weeks before. Instead, they met something unexpected, a wall of quiet confidence that refused to crack under pressure. Emma's response came not as a shout or a challenge, but as something far more powerful, the truth delivered with unshakable certainty. "I think you're scared," she said, her voice carrying across the hallway with clarity that made other students stop and listen. "I think you pick on people because you're afraid of what happens when you're not the biggest person in the room. And I think you know that being mean doesn't make you strong, it just makes you small." The silence that followed stretched like a held breath, and Sarah watched as Marcus's carefully constructed image began to crumble under the weight of words that cut deeper than any insult. His followers shifted uncomfortably, suddenly uncertain about their allegiance to someone who looked less like a leader and more like a frightened child caught in a lie. The power dynamic that had ruled the hallways for months shifted in that moment, not through violence but through the simple act of refusing to be afraid. Marcus's response was predictable, a desperate lunge forward that spoke of someone who had run out of words and fallen back on the only tool he understood. But Emma was ready for him, not with fists, but with something the man in the gym had taught her about moving through space like water, about being where trouble wasn't instead of where it was. She stepped aside with fluid grace, and Marcus stumbled past her into the water fountain, his dignity soaking into the floor along with the water from his shirt. The laughter that erupted from the gathered students wasn't cruel, but it was final. The sound of a spell being broken, of a bully's power dissolving like sugar in rain. Marcus picked himself up from the floor, his face red with embarrassment and rage. But the moment had passed. The fear that had given him control over his classmates was gone, replaced by something that looked suspiciously like pity. Emma didn't gloat or celebrate. She simply walked away, leaving Marcus to face the consequences of a reputation built on borrowed strength. That afternoon, Sarah found herself back at the gym, searching for the man who had given her daughter something more valuable than self-defense techniques. He had given her back herself. But the building stood empty, the heavy bags hanging motionless in air that no longer carried the sound of leather hitting canvas. The ring sat silent in the center of the room, and the corner where Emma had learned to stand tall showed no sign that miracles had ever happened there. The other trainers claimed they had never seen anyone matching his description, their faces blank, with the kind of confusion that suggested Sarah was describing someone who had never existed. But Emma's transformation was real, her newfound confidence as solid as the bruises that had finally begun to fade from her arms. The techniques she had learned worked not because they were magical, but because they were true, because someone had taken the time to show a frightened child that she was stronger than she knew. Weeks passed before Sarah found the first clue, a yellowed newspaper clipping tucked behind a loose board in the gym's office, dated 3 years after Muhammad Ali's official death. The headline spoke of a mysterious trainer who had appeared at youth centers across the country, working with children who had nowhere else to turn, teaching them that greatness wasn't about winning fights, but about refusing to surrender to despair. The article was brief and skeptical, the kind of story newspapers ran when they couldn't quite debunk something, but couldn't bring themselves to believe it either. More stories emerged as Sarah dug deeper, whispered accounts from parents whose children had been transformed by encounters with a man who shouldn't have existed but somehow did. A girl in Detroit who had learned to stand up to racist bullies. A boy in Los Angeles who had found his voice after years of being silenced by poverty and neglect. Dozens of children across the country who had discovered that champions weren't born, but made through the simple act of refusing to give up. The pattern was always the same: a child in crisis, a desperate parent, and the appearance of someone who taught lessons that went far beyond boxing. He never stayed long, never asked for payment, never left behind anything more substantial than changed lives and the lingering scent of leather and determination. By the time anyone thought to ask questions, he was gone, leaving only the evidence of his impact in the form of children who walked taller and spoke with voices that couldn't be silenced. Emma's story became part of that legacy, though she never spoke about the man who had taught her to fight without fighting. When other children asked about her transformation, she simply smiled and said she had learned that bullies were only as powerful as the fear they could inspire, and fear was a choice that could be unmade. The wisdom in her words carried weight that seemed too heavy for an 8-year-old to bear, but she wore it lightly, like a championship belt that fit perfectly despite being sized for someone much larger. The bullying at Jefferson Elementary didn't end overnight, but it changed in fundamental ways that rippled through the school like stones thrown into still water. Marcus Thompson found himself increasingly isolated as other students began to question the social order that had placed him at the top of a hierarchy built on cruelty. Teachers who had once turned blind eyes to hallway confrontations suddenly found themselves paying attention, as if Emma's refusal to be a victim had awakened something in them that had been sleeping too long. Sarah watched her daughter's continued growth with a mixture of pride and bewilderment, still unable to fully explain what had happened in that gym or who had made it possible. The rational part of her mind insisted on logical explanations: a dedicated trainer who preferred anonymity, a method actor preparing for a role, a lookalike who had found purpose in helping children. But the part of her that had seen her daughter transform from victim to victor whispered different possibilities: stories about legends who refused to stay buried, and champions who continued fighting long after the final bell had rung. The truth, Sarah realized, mattered less than the result. Emma was safe, strong and whole again, her laughter echoing through their house like music that had been missing for too long. The bruises had faded completely, but more importantly, the fear that had lived behind her daughter's eyes had been replaced by something that looked suspiciously like hope. Whatever had happened in that gym, whoever had made it possible, had given them back their lives and their faith in the possibility that good could triumph over evil when someone was brave enough to stand up and fight. On quiet evenings, when Emma practiced the techniques she had learned, moving through shadowboxing combinations with grace that seemed too advanced for her age, Sarah sometimes caught glimpses of the man who had taught her. Not physically, but in the way Emma carried herself, in the confidence that radiated from her like light from a candle that refused to be extinguished. The lessons lived on in her daughter's movements, in her voice, in the way she faced each new day, as if it held infinite possibilities rather than endless threats. The gym downtown eventually closed, its windows boarded up and its doors chained shut, but the impact of what had happened there continued to spread through the community like ripples on a pond. Other parents began sharing stories of their own encounters with bullying, and slowly, a network of support began to form around children who had been suffering in silence. Emma became an unofficial ambassador for this movement, not through speeches or organized events, but simply by being living proof that transformation was possible when someone cared enough to show a child their own strength. Years later, when Emma had grown into a teenager whose confidence seemed as natural as breathing, she would sometimes speak about the man who had changed her life. Her descriptions were always vague, focusing more on what he had taught her than who he had been, but there was something in her voice when she mentioned him that suggested she understood the magnitude of what had occurred. She spoke of him as if he were still present, still watching, still ready to appear when children needed someone to show them that they were stronger than their circumstances. The legend grew quietly, passed from parent to parent in whispered conversations about the mysterious trainer who appeared when hope seemed lost and disappeared when his work was done. Some claimed he was a ghost. Others insisted he was simply a dedicated volunteer who valued privacy over recognition. But for the children whose lives he had touched, the explanation mattered less than the experience. The knowledge that someone had believed in them enough to teach them how to believe in themselves. Sarah kept the newspaper clipping in her jewelry box, along with other treasures that marked important moments in their lives. Sometimes she would take it out and read it again, searching for clues that might explain what had happened to them, but the answers always seemed just out of reach. The mystery remained unsolved, but the miracle was undeniable. Her daughter had been saved by someone who shouldn't have existed, but somehow did. Someone who had shown them both that champions could be made from the most unlikely materials when someone cared enough to do the work. The impact of those weeks in the gym extended far beyond Emma's personal transformation, creating ripples that continued to spread through their community long after the man had vanished. Other children began standing up to their own bullies, inspired by Emma's example and armed with techniques that seemed to come from nowhere but worked with startling effectiveness. Teachers reported a decrease in hallway incidents, and parents found themselves having different conversations with their children about conflict and courage. Emma's story became a whispered legend among the students at Jefferson Elementary, though the details grew more fantastic with each retelling. Some claimed she had been trained by a secret government agent. Others insisted she had learned martial arts from a mysterious monk. The truth was both simpler and more complex than any of these explanations, rooted in the basic human need to believe that help could come from unexpected places when it was needed most. As you watch Emma's journey unfold and see how one moment of intervention can change everything, remember that we all have the power to be someone's unexpected hero. The courage to stand up, to speak out, to refuse to let injustice go unchallenged. These aren't superpowers reserved for legends. They're choices available to each of us every single day. In your own life, in your own community, there's probably a child who needs someone to show them their strength, someone to prove that bullies only win when good people choose to look away. The question isn't whether you have the power to make a difference. It's whether you'll choose to use it when the moment comes. This story lives in the space between what we can prove and what we choose to believe, in the realm where legends walk among us disguised as ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Whether the man in the gym was who he appeared to be matters less than the truth he represented. That champions aren't born, they're made, one act of courage at a time.